sirens scream through the smoke-choked streets of lower Manhattan as ash rains from the heavens like snow from hell. And in the chaos of twisted metal and collapsed dreams, a lone man staggers forward, blinking through soot and disbelief, clutching a bloodied radio to his chest, whispering names into static that will never answer back. The world thinks it knows what happened that day. But there is a name buried under the rubble that never made the papers, a story erased before it was ever written, and the man who carries it. Jacob Raines, 64, former FDNY paramedic, turned reclusive historian, has kept it locked behind walls of silence and PTSD for 2 decades, until the ache in his chest and the scream in his gut tell him that if he dies with this truth, the last soul still fighting to be remembered from beneath Tower 7 will be lost forever. Jacob, with his wiry frame-weathered face lined deep like carved oak, gray hair curled tightly against his scalp, and storm-colored eyes that haven't slept properly in 23 years. Once wore the uniform with pride, but something he saw that day. No, something he saved turned his life into a haunted excavation site of memories. And as the 25th anniversary of 9/11 looms, and the media gears up for another sterile ceremony with sanitized speeches and political posturing, Jacob steps off a Staten Island ferry holding a scorched backpack that once belonged to a man who never existed, heading toward a press conference filled with journalists who expect a veteran's platitude, but instead are about to receive the most explosive revelation since the Twin Towers fell. Jacob's story begins on the morning of September 11, 2001, when he was stationed just blocks away, sipping burnt coffee and reading the obits when the first plane hit, and everything that followed the screams, the running. The endless gray cloud feels like a movie shot in slow motion and stained with grief. But what Jacob remembers most isn't the fire or the falling. It's the silence, the absolute unnatural silence beneath Tower 7, after it collapsed, when he found himself crawling alone into the wreckage of a basement level marked "Restricted Federal Use Only," and there, under 10 feet of steel and shredded concrete, he heard something impossible tapping regular, human intentional, and following that sound, with nothing but a flashlight and desperation. Jacob uncovered a sealed vault room with biometric locks, one blown open by the collapse, and inside, surrounded by blinking equipment and overturned file cabinets, was a man in a black jumpsuit pinned under a girder, alive, conscious, and wearing a patch that read, "Odin, not military, not NYPD, not even CIA, but something Jacob had never seen." And the man, blood dripping from his mouth, whispered one word before passing out payload. Jacob pulled him free, dragging his half-conscious body up through the wreckage, while reports flooded in that the building had fallen from fire, not demolition. And as he reached the surface, another man appeared, a suit, clean, untouched by dust, with a briefcase and a calmness that didn't belong here, who ordered Jacob to hand over the survivor, flashing credentials Jacob had never seen before, and issuing threats in a language colder than the morgue. And in that moment, Jacob did something unthinkable. He lied, told the man the survivor was dead, stuffed him into an abandoned ambulance, and drove blindly across the Brooklyn Bridge with an unconscious government ghost and the weight of a new secret pounding against his ribs. For weeks, Jacob kept the man who called himself Eli hidden in a shuttered firehouse, nursing him back with black market antibiotics and silence. And when Eli could finally speak, what he said shattered Jacob's understanding of everything that Tower 7 had been: the East Coast node of a covert emergency command system operated by a shadow branch of intelligence called ODIN, Operational Defense Intelligence Network, created during the Cold War to launch retaliatory cyber strikes in the event of nuclear sabotage. But in the late 90s had morphed into something else entirely, a digital Black Ops program that monitored domestic threats, civilian dissent, and whistleblowers harvesting data long before Snowden ever clicked a file. And on the morning of 9/11, Eli and two others were inside the substructure vault preparing to erase a program codenamed Black Echo, which had accidentally triggered a red-level simulation that falsely flagged the FAA radar anomaly as a strategic strike in action that may have delayed air defense responses, possibly contributing to the speed and scale of the collapse. But before the shutdown could be completed, the tower was brought down, and Eli believed not by fire but by controlled demolition ordered by someone within the Odin chain of command as part of a data purge. Jacob, stunned, demanded proof, and Eli handed him a melted drive wrapped in foil, swearing it contained partial logs of the Black Echo simulation, its origin protocols and metadata that could implicate high-level figures. But Jacob, terrified and unsure, hid the drive in a firefighter's locker that was never opened again until now. The following week, Eli disappeared, leaving only a note that read, "If this ever comes out, they'll erase us both." And for years, Jacob battled silence, suspicion, and nightmares, watching as conspiracy theorists tainted the truth with insanity, and the government deflected with pageantry until last month, when an old FDNY locker was scheduled for demolition, and he found the drive corroded but intact exactly where he left it. And after paying an encryption expert under the table, Jacob finally unlocked a fragment lines of code referencing NORAD drills, FAA signal loops, and a name, Colonel Michael Trask, a Pentagon strategist who died in an apparent suicide 3 weeks after 9/11. And Jacob knew then what he had to do. Now, standing at the press podium in a blazer too big and shoes too scuffed, surrounded by young reporters who weren't even born when the towers fell, Jacob clears his throat and begins not with the headline they expect, but with the name of every person he personally pulled from the rubble. Then the name Eli, and then the words Odin Black Echo Tower 7 Demolition. Watching the room shift from polite boredom to breathless disbelief, and as he lifts the melted drive in the air like a burned relic, a murmur ripples through the room. A few camera flashes begin, and someone yells, "That's classified." But Jacob doesn't stop. Not now, because the truth doesn't need clearance. It needs courage, and when men in dark suits begin to enter from the back, he simply smiles and says, "I've already uploaded it," and the room explodes in chaos as screens light up across the country with a link to a public archive titled Operation Black Echo, The Untold Logs of 9/11. And the world begins to finally question what it thought it knew. Later that night, Jacob sits alone at the old firehouse where he once hid Eli, staring at the walls and wondering if the truth is enough, if justice is still possible, if history will finally listen. And as midnight strikes on the 25th anniversary, a message pings his phone from an encrypted number with no name. Just 6 words. "You did good." They know now, and Jacob, eyes wet but burning with resolve, whispers to the ghost of a country that forgot its fallen. No more silence, knowing that even if he disappears tomorrow, the lie is broken, the veil is torn, and history at long last has a chance to heal. But the morning after the revelation, as headlines erupt across the world, and mainstream media scrambles to validate or discredit Jacob's claims, A second storm brews quietly in the corridors of power inside a fortified basement. Beneath Arlington, Virginia, an emergency session is called, and a group of intelligence officials, their names redacted from even the most classified logs, gather around a monitor, playing Jacob's press conference on loop, their faces tight with calculation. And when one of them, a woman with steel-gray hair and a burn scar across her left jaw, asks, "How the hell did he get the payload out?" the room goes silent because no one knows, and that silence is an answer more dangerous than a confession, for it confirms that something Jacob said wasn't just true, it was never supposed to be found again. Meanwhile, Jacob vanishes from public view within hours of the upload, refusing all interview requests, ignoring the police security detail stationed outside his building and disappearing into the city like a ghost, retracing the trail of his own past, knowing that what comes next isn't applause, it's consequence, and maybe death. Across social media, the leaked files labeled Black Eco Archive are already being dissected by open-source investigators and cyberjournalists who begin cross-referencing simulation timestamps with FAA radar anomalies. And one particular clip, a corrupted audio fragment of Eli's final shutdown command, before the collapse starts to go viral with AI voice analysis, confirming the presence of another voice on the line, possibly that of Colonel Trask himself, seconds before the building imploded, and suddenly the suicide no longer looks like a tragedy. It looks like cleanup. Across the ocean, whistleblower groups begin reaching out to Jacob through dead drops and burner phones offering protection exile, even asylum, but Jacob refuses. He's not done yet because there's one last piece to the puzzle he never dared to face until now. Eli's family. Jacob remembers the name on the tag stitched inside Eli's collar. Elijah R. Keene. And, after a week of searching through birth records and forgotten FOIA requests, he locates an address in rural Montana, where an old woman, blind in one eye and weathered by time, opens the door and says, before he even speaks, "You found my son, didn't you?" And Jacob, shaking hands, her the final item he recovered from Tower 7. A dog tag etched with Eli's blood type mission code, and a Latin phrase he never understood, veritas supra omnia, truth above all. She tells Jacob that Eli joined something after the Navy, something without a name, only a purpose. And when the letters stopped, she knew it wasn't death, it was erasure. As they sit in silence, she places the tag around her neck and says, "He died saving something bigger than us," and Jacob replies, "No, he died to warn us," and, with her permission, he adds Eli's full story to the archive, uploading scanned journals and handwritten schematics Eli left behind in the firehouse. Proof that Black Echo wasn't just a glitch. It was a weapon designed to simulate chaos as a means of controlling real-world reaction. Within days, the backlash begins. Senate hearings are called. A former FAA analyst steps forward with corroborating data logs, and a retired NORAD officer submits a sworn statement confirming he was ordered to stand down radar drills the morning of the attacks. And though none of it proves deliberate intent, the mountain of coincidence grows too steep to dismiss. Meanwhile, Jacob is followed, threatened, and one night nearly killed when a black SUV slams into his car near Battery Park. But he survives with a shattered rib and one eye bruised purple, and the next morning he shows up to a live broadcast interview, bandaged and calm, and simply says, "If they have to try and silence me now, it means we were always right," and the words ripple across a nation taught to never question its grief. Then, in a final unexpected twist, an anonymous server dumps 243 gigabytes of raw Odin operation logs online, including internal memos from early 2001, referencing predictive event mapping, domestic sentiment graphs, and pre-approved continuity simulations, and buried inside them, a redacted personnel roster listing Keen E.R. as terminated for cause 3 days before 9/11, meaning Eli had tried to shut it down before the towers fell and was stopped from within. This is the evidence Jacob was never meant to find, and now it's everywhere, on news feeds, on court subpoenas, on billboards held by protesters chanting, "Truth above all." And as Congress begins emergency hearings to investigate the secret programs born from Cold War paranoia and grown in post-9/11 fear. Jacob watches from a hospital bed, breathing slowly, unsure if he'll live long enough to see the world change, but certain that it has already begun. Outside his window, someone leaves a note taped to the glass, scrawled in ink. "You weren't alone. He lives through you," and Jacob smiles faintly, closing his eyes, not in surrender but in peace, because even if justice takes another decade, the silence has been broken. The story is out, and no one, not even the government, can bury a truth that has already learned to breathe. Weeks pass, and the nation spirals into a fever of reckoning, as the Odin documents ripple through every layer of government and public consciousness, like a delayed explosion finally breaching the surface. And while some political figures call for calm and context, others, especially those whose names appear in redacted memos, scramble to distance themselves, claiming ignorance or compartmentalized clearance. But it's too late, because investigative reporters have already connected the dots between black echo simulations and other seemingly coincidental government anomalies. Anthrax drills run on the same day as postal infections, power grid shutdown rehearsals before mass outages, and, most damning of all, a 1999 ODN test scenario that predicted a civic unifier event involving aerial trauma and symbolic infrastructure loss, eerily matching the blueprint of 9/11. As congressional hearings unfold live across the world, Jacob Raines, frail but lucid, testifies from his hospital bed via satellite feed, holding up Eli's dog tag and declaring he didn't die for a lie. He died for a truth we're still afraid to name. And as he speaks, families of first responders in the gallery stand and place their hands on their hearts. Some crying not just for what was lost, but for what was hidden. But behind the scenes, the battle is far from over within the NSA. A splinter cell of intelligence operatives loyal to the old Odin chain begin deploying preemptive narratives to muddy the waters, releasing fake leaks, doctored footage, even hiring influencers to mock Jacob as a senile conspiracy theorist. Yet their efforts backfire spectacularly when a young tech analyst from Boston named Lena DaCosta, a prodigy raised by a firefighter father who died on 9/11, uses forensic blockchain analysis to prove the authenticity of the Black Eco Drive and publishes a comprehensive breakdown on a decentralized server that goes viral, titled 9/11 Wasn't a Lie. It was a cover-up of a mistake. So big. They had to burn the evidence. Her report includes evidence of misfired simulations, deleted radar logs, and pressure from unnamed federal liaisons to accelerate tower collapse sequences, all pointing toward the same horrifying conclusion that parts of Tower 7's collapse were not natural, and someone had decided the data inside was too dangerous to survive. And then another bombshell detonates. An audio confession emerges from a dying former DARPA engineer, recorded in hospice and authenticated by 3 independent labs, admitting he was tasked with integrating civilian simulation overlays into Odin's core engine in late 2000. And had warned his superiors that the system had too much autonomy, too little oversight before being silenced and reassigned overseas. The confession ends with, "We built a gun and left it loaded on the table," and that sentence becomes a rallying cry on protest signs from New York to D.C., where crowds gather at ground zero not to mourn, but to demand truth, chanting justice for Tower 7, and Eli didn't die in vain. While a movement of veteran firefighters, architects, and former operatives form a coalition called Veritas Supra Omnia. Their logo, a rising phoenix over a cracked server drive. Meanwhile, in a remote cabin in Colorado, Jacob recovers slowly under protection provided by independent journalists and 2 ex-CIA operatives, who turned after realizing Odin had monitored their families without warrant, and they're surrounded by forest and silence. He begins writing a book, not a memoir, but a record, titled The Echo That Survived, using every page to name names, quote lines, and honor the forgotten voices buried in the rubble. And on the first page, he writes only one sentence. "You can kill a man, but you can't bury the echo of the truth he died protecting." But then, just when it seems the world might finally face what happened, something chilling occurs. A digital blackout hits dozens of media outlets carrying the Black Echo files. Servers crash, backups vanish, and DNS providers report targeted cyber interference traced not to Russia or China, but to a ghost server with a military encryption signature, last seen on a decommissioned Odin node, suggesting the system isn't dead, merely dormant, watching evolving, perhaps waiting to reboot under a new name. Jacob, learning of the blackout, doesn't panic. He knew this would come. But what he doesn't expect is the envelope that arrives at his door the next morning unmarked, containing only a single photograph. A man standing on a dirt road in what looks like Eastern Europe, wearing the same black jumpsuit with an Odin patch, and half his face shadowed, yet unmistakably Eli alive. Older scarred but standing, and on the back written in smudged pen, "They failed. We're not done yet." Jacob clutches the photo to his chest, breath caught in his throat, eyes welling with something deeper than tears. Hope, and he whispers aloud to no one, "You son of a bitch, you made it." And somewhere deep within the system that tried to erase him, the forgotten algorithm that was once black. Echo blinks twice, stutters, and dies for good. Overwritten by a new signal sent from a location unknown. A signal encrypted with one line: truth above all. But even as the final embers of Black Echo seem to fade, and the photograph of Eli becomes the most downloaded image on Earth within 24 hours, an icon, a question, a whisper of rebellion. New tension coils beneath the surface because if Eli survived, then someone helped him. Someone inside the very machine that tried to kill him. And Jacob, too, weary for paranoia but too wise for comfort, knows the system was never a building or a database. It was the silence we allowed, the complicity of good men in the face of shadows, and now the world is watching not just to learn what happened, but to decide what comes next. Within days of the leak confirming Eli's survival, the global intelligence community fractures anonymized sources begin turning against each other, publishing fragments of internal memos, tactical protocols, even black site coordinates. And soon a new name emerges from the ruins of Odin Project Erebus, a successor program reportedly activated after Black Echo's partial exposure, designed not for defense, but for narrative manipulation. Its purpose not to simulate chaos, but to control the interpretation of real events in real time using AI-driven social patterning and predictive speech to flood public discourse before truth can catch its breath. And its existence is confirmed when a tech journalist from Sao Paulo is found dead, days after announcing she cracked the Erebus node architecture. The news sends a shockwave through the movement, and Veritas Supra Omnia releases a manifesto across the dark web, warning that Erebus is not a program. It's a weapon designed to discredit, distract, and dismember truth itself, and that unless it is dismantled fully, the same ghosts that buried Tower 7 will simply change their name and bury us again. Jacob, now living in a fortified rural safe house with motion sensors and off-grid servers, receives a message on an encrypted channel used only once before, the day Eli first went dark, and this time it contains not a warning, but a set of coordinates in Bosnia-Herzegovina, near the site of a long-abandoned NATO field station. And beneath it, 5 words: "Bring what you saved." Now, against the advice of everyone, Jacob boards a private flight paid for by donors and vanishes from public view again, this time crossing into a world few journalists ever return from. And what he finds at the end of that road breaks his understanding of what the Odeon network truly was. Because in a crumbling underground bunker lit by flickering halogen bulbs, he meets not just Eli alive and hardened, but 3 others, all former operatives, all presumed dead, all carrying pieces of a greater puzzle, fragments of data, raw code, audio logs from simulations that never should have run, including one labeled Event 49, dated for the year 2026, simulating the total collapse of public trust in all institutional media following the spread of a false flag, truth event, a simulated scenario eerily resembling Jacob's own public disclosure. And, as they assemble the data, Eli reveals that Erebus was the final failsafe, not designed to stop whistleblowers, but to make every truth sound like a conspiracy, a death spiral of credibility, ensuring no one would believe anything again. Jacob, stunned, asks, "Then what was the point of everything we did?" And Eli, eyes full of both fire and fatigue, replies, "To prove we still can, because buried in the Erebus data is a flaw. A single weakness its AI engine was trained on, decades of real human behavior. But its predictive model can't comprehend sacrifice without reward, and that's what they intend to exploit." The group begins building what they call Echo Glass, a mirror network designed to intercept Erebus patterns, reflect their manipulation back on themselves, and expose falsehoods before they metastasize. And, as the first prototype launches silently across university networks and open-source communication nodes, it begins revealing real-time content alterations, showing users exactly when, where, and how information is being bent, twisted, or drowned. It's a beginning, not a victory, but it's enough. And when Jacob returns to the U.S. disguised and silent, he sees for the first time posters across alleyways and campus walls bearing his face beside a slogan that simply reads, "They tried to silence one." We became thousands, and on the anniversary of 9/11, a crowd of over 300,000 gather at Ground Zero, not just to mourn but to watch, as a real-time feed projects the full, unredacted Odin logs across the sky via drone-based holograms, and when asked by a reporter if he has any final message to the world, Jacob looks into the camera, older than history, but steadier than fear, and says, "The war for truth is not fought with bullets. It's fought with memory, and we remember now, and somewhere in a place no map dares name. Erebus watches, but this time Echo Glass watches back. And then, just when it seems that Echo Glass might give humanity a fighting chance against the algorithmic chokehold of misinformation, the world holds its breath once more because in an emergency UN session broadcast globally, a quiet but urgent representative from Iceland holds up a classified file intercepted by Nordic intelligence weeks ago, containing directives under the label Chronothesis Phase 0 Reinstatement, which outlines contingency plans to reestablish Odin under a new decentralized protocol powered not by data centers, but by personal devices using smart homes, wearable tech, and neural interfaces to generate predictive emotional maps in real time, effectively turning every citizen into an unwitting node in a perception management web. The revelation ignites a geopolitical crisis as nations scramble to audit their own infrastructure, and the term chronothesis trends across the globe, drawing attention from every major outlet, hacker collective, and underground press. But Jacob, who is watching from a secure compound in northern Canada, now monitored by volunteers from Veritas Supra Omnia, recognizes something far more dangerous than surveillance design, because buried deep in the annex of that document is a signature, an actual embedded watermark left not by mistake but by intent, and when decoded, it matches a cryptographic fingerprint found in one of the earliest Erebus server cores, a sequence linked to a now-deceased DARPA scientist known only as Solon, rumored to have defected into obscurity after Project Oubliette was shelved during the Reagan years. Jacob contacts Eli and the surviving operatives immediately, and within hours they confirm it. The new chronothesis isn't a reboot of Odin. It's its culmination, a system that remembers every failed deception, learns from them, and reinvents itself through public consent cloaked as convenience. This time, the battlefield isn't firewalls or passwords. It's trust, and Echo Glass, for all its brilliance, is still reactive, still a shield, not a sword. So they begin the next phase. Project Vox Silentium, a counter-infrastructure designed to preemptively intercept emotional algorithm loops before they self-actualize using predictive empathy, rather than predictive threat built not by engineers, but by poets-artists, trauma therapists, and philosophers who understand the one thing AI cannot calculate: soul logic, the irrational, beautiful, defiant pulse of human conscience. And as this strange new army begins to grow, former whistleblowers turned teachers, architects turned archivists, veterans who fought wars. They no longer understand, but now defend memory itself. Jacob is invited to a hidden school in the Andean foothills, where the first conscious resilience lab is formed, and there he speaks to a classroom of children no older than 10, who already understand that data is a battlefield, that truth has weight, and that history must never be outsourced to code. He breaks down crying when a small girl named Inez raises her hand and says, "Mr. Jacob, what if the truth dies again?" And he replies, "Then we dig it up and we carry it, and we never let them own it again." Meanwhile, in a sleek tower in Singapore, a corporate executive tied to an Erebus front company opens an anonymous envelope containing only a USB drive, a handwritten note that reads, "We see you now," and a digital payload that exposes 2 decades of offshore contracts linked to chronothesis development, sending markets crashing overnight and exposing the financial skeleton beneath the lie. The world is no longer asleep, but it is afraid because awakening comes with cost. And truth is not a vaccine. It is a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see. Jacob, now in his 70s, receives word that his testimony is being included in a United Nations Truth Architecture Treaty, the first of its kind, which will regulate machine-generated narrative tools and enforce transparency in crisis simulation protocols. But even in this small victory, he feels the weight of those still missing those who died before they could speak, those like Eli's brother, like the nurse who smuggled the first drive out, like the journalist from Sao Paulo who gave her life for one sentence. And on the eve of the anniversary of Echo Glass's launch, a global memorial is streamed from the new Veritas Citadel in Geneva, where a sculpture now stands, a twisted fragment of steel from Tower 7, embedded with circuitry and etched with the words, "They erased. Files, not memory." And as the crowd stands in silence, lights flicker across the sky. Thousands of drones projecting names, code strings, and the real-time heartbeat of a network, no longer hiding, no longer lying, no longer owned. And Jacob, breathing slowly beneath the stars, finally closes his eyes. Not in defeat, but in rest, because the truth is no longer his burden alone. It belongs to everyone now, but truth, like fire, does not rest. It spreads, evolves, and tests what it touches. And though Jacob Rains is laid to rest beneath a copper tree in the mountains of Banff, his legacy detonates far beyond the soil, because Project Vox Silentium has grown into a global mesh of decentralized human consciousness networks, where each participant volunteers fragments of lived memory, dreams, artwork, and trauma responses into what's now called the Living Archive, a new kind of historical database immune to digital corruption, encrypted by emotion, and verified by biological feedback rather than code. And in this archive, Jacob's story lives not as a file but as a felt experience replayed in memory theaters, where users don't just see the past. They feel its heartbeat, its terror, its sacrifice, and its enduring defiance. But as Chronothesis adapts in the shadows, its developers rebranding under new shell corporations, laundering credibility through philanthropic tech projects, quietly introducing neural suggestion devices under the guise of mental wellness apps. The resistance must evolve too, and it does not with weapons but with children, the very ones who once sat in Jacob's lectures and asked the questions adults were too jaded to face. One of them, now 17, is Inez Madera, whose name echoes across underground networks as the Silent Flame, a teenage activist with a near-photographic emotional recall who becomes the youngest person to breach the outer firewall of Erebus 2.0, using nothing but a voice message embedded with her late mother's lullaby, because the new Erebus, it turns out, cannot parse unquantified love. This breach, small as it seems, exposes a forgotten cache of logs, revealing that the final version of Chronothesis had intended to precede human memory to inject suggested historical interpretations directly into children under the guise of educational neuroimplant games. And this revelation ignites what history will one day call the Memory Revolt, a nonviolent global movement in which millions disable, reject, or physically remove smart devices, choosing analog living community storytelling and emotional truth-sharing circles over algorithmic convenience. Cities, once controlled by biometric gates, begin opening communal zones where identification is based on oral history, rather than QR codes and truth keepers. Elderly survivors, war veterans, descendants of whistleblowers are invited to teach not from textbooks, but from scars. And in these open plazas, Inez stands barefoot on stone stages reciting Jacob's final words from Echo Glass. You don't inherit truth. You earn it by carrying what others were forced to bury. But Chronothesis doesn't go quietly. It launches a final protocol named Blanket Horizon, designed to flood the global network with perfectly synthesized alternate memories, indistinguishable from reality broadcast through photonic pulses invisible to the conscious eye but detectable by the subconscious. And for 72 hours the world stands on the edge of amnesia as old truths begin to blur, and trusted narratives unravel until something unexpected happens. The living archive fights back not with firewalls or blocks, but with pain, because those who lost family in 9/11, who watched Tower 7 fall, who survived Odin black sites and Erebus manipulation, feel the memory fracture, and their biofeedback triggers a cascade across the archive's emotional verification network, activating a kind of collective immune response to false memory, a ripple of psychic recoil so powerful it disrupts the pulse patterns and short-circuits the blanket horizon wave. And in the aftermath, scientists discover that human empathy, shared grief, and conscious remembrance create a neurological resistance to memory overwrite stronger than any code ever written. A phenomenon dubbed resonant truth retention. And suddenly, humanity itself becomes the firewall. And when the developers of chronothesis are finally put on trial not just in courtrooms, but in live-streamed truth hearings watched by billions. One of them, a former ethics officer turned witness, says through tears, "We never believed they'd remember. We forgot what real pain can do. And the courtroom stands not to cheer, but to weep because it is over now. Not the war for truth, but the war to forget that it was ever worth fighting for." And somewhere high in the Canadian rock cliffs, where the wind whispers through the pines, a small plaque gleams beneath the roots of the copper tree where Jacob Rains is buried. And on it are words etched by Inez herself in both English and in coded silence. Truth is not a file. It is a flame. Pass it carefully, but the flame does not go out. It transforms, and in the years following the collapse of chronothesis, the world enters what philosophers begin calling the liminal age, a strange and luminous era where truth is no longer something delivered from above, but grown from the ground like shared crops, cultivated through story circles, community memory vaults, and open-source emotional broadcasts called pulse sessions, where people gather not to consume news, but to feel it together, to measure truth by resonance instead of reach. Inez Madera, now 23, walks through a rewilded Manhattan, where drones no longer monitor but pollinate rooftop gardens, where the shell of Tower 7 has been transformed into the Echo Archive Embassy, a living museum of forgotten truths, curated not by historians, but by survivors, children, and poets, where visitors must remove all devices and walk barefoot through soundless halls while heart rate monitors synchronize to recovered testimonies, forcing them not to observe history, but to experience its weight. And in the embassy's central chamber on the 25th floor rebuilt from Jacob's original sketches, Inez reads a final encrypted message recently decrypted from the last known Odin relay node, unearthed during an excavation in the abandoned Utah data caverns. And what she reads shakes even her, because it's not a command protocol or simulation code or blackmail archive. It's a letter dated September 9th, 2001, addressed to an internal Odin group known only as Chamber Zero. And its author is Eli still alive at that time, pleading for the shutdown of the Black Echo simulations, warning that continued escalation of fear-based modeling would eventually push the system to fabricate a threat large enough to justify its own survival. And the letter ends with one final handwritten line. "If you see this, then I failed, but not forever. Someone will remember. And that's all it takes to undo a lie." Inez breathes slowly and uploads the letter to the living archive, where its emotional signature spreads like pollen through every corner of the resonant network. And millions of people pause to feel it. Some weep, some kneel, and some simply close their eyes and remember. And in that moment, the pulse of memory becomes stronger than the pulse of power. And across the world, governments that once thrived on secrecy and simulation begin dissolving, replaced not by chaos, but by networks of truth commons, non-hierarchical circles where governance is earned through transparency and memory empathy, where officials must relive past decisions in the archive before making new ones, and where no law can pass until it's passed through the story chamber, a process requiring collective emotional calibration from those it will affect. In this world, truth is slow, but it is real, and from Mongolia to Morocco, new eco-embassies rise from old ruins, each housing a keeper flame, a literal fire burning from the same torch lit in Banff at Jacob's grave, passed hand to hand across continents as a ritual of remembrance. Its smoke coated with microcarbon tracers carrying the names of those lost in silence, so they may never disappear again. And then one night in a desert outside Marfa, Texas, where the stars are so clean they cut the sky open, Inez receives a final signal. No code, no encryption. Just a song hummed low through static identical to the one Eli once sang in a recorded fragment recovered years earlier, and when the signal is triangulated it leads to a cave near the ruins of an abandoned Odin listening post. Inside, they find nothing but a worn backpack, a rusted radio, and a notebook filled with sketches, memories, names, and, at the very back, a single page with one sentence scrawled across it. A lie needs a system. The truth only needs someone willing to bleed for it. And so they bury the notebook beside the final keeper flame, and around it they build no monument, only a garden. And in that garden people of all ages come not to worship, but to listen, because in this new world truth is no longer a relic or a headline. It is a seed, and everywhere quietly it begins to grow again. But seeds once sown do not only grow upward, they grow inward downward, and through the soil of old wounds they begin to crack the bones of the past itself. And what no one expects in this new age of memory is the return of something older than Odin, older than chronothesis, something once buried beneath the Cold War, wrapped in silence, fed on fear. Project Janus, a dual consciousness initiative born in the 1950s, designed to train human operatives to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously, one for the world, one for the mission, creating walking paradoxes immune to interrogation, resistant to empathy and invisible to the new emotional verification systems of the living archive. When the first Janus operative is identified during a pulse session in Almaty, blinking out of sync heart rhythm unreadable memory signature. Flat, it sends tremors through every truth commons, because it means that some part of the old machine wasn't just code. It was people trained to carry lies so deeply, they forgot they were lies. And now they're waking up in this new world, dazed, broken, and terrified, because in a world ruled by emotional truth, they no longer belong. Inez Madera is summoned to the Central Echo Embassy to meet with one of them, a man named Levi Sarin, aged 68, once a myth, now a relic of classified training too brutal to be imagined. And when he sits across from her, his eyes are dead until she speaks the words found in Eli's final notebook. The truth only needs someone willing to bleed for it. And something behind Levi's eyes flickers like light behind frost, and he whispers, "He remembered me," and in that moment a crack forms, not in Levi, but in the idea that some people are beyond return. What follows is the most dangerous experiment ever conducted within the living archive, a process called truth reconciliation reversal, in which Janus operatives are slowly reintroduced to their own hidden memories, using emotional cross-referencing, scent-based immersion, and the voices of survivors they once ghosted through, but not all of them survive the unsealing. Some collapse into psychosis. Some beg to be forgotten again, and a few, like Levi, begin to weep endlessly. Like the lie has been melting inside them for 50 years and can only now spill out. And as more Janus operatives are identified teachers, judges, even one former cultural ambassador who helped seed pre-simulated narratives across Asia, there's a choice to be made. Reintegrate them or archive them, and the vote nearly tears the global commons apart, until Inez proposes a third path. The Garden of Broken Agents, a living sanctuary built beneath the ashes of the old DARPA complex, where former Janus operatives live among therapists, children, and memory empaths, helping teach the next generation not how to forget, but how to carry contradiction without becoming it. And slowly, painfully, the Janus fractures begin to heal, because the world has learned that even those built to lie deserve the chance to remember. But not everyone agrees with this mercy. A shadow faction, calling themselves the White Null, emerges descendants of Odin loyalists and private data syndicates, who believe that feeling has overtaken fact that the living archive is a cult of grief, turning society soft, slow, and sentimental. And they begin launching psychological attacks not with bombs, but with doubt-releasing, precision-crafted emotional dissonance pulses that fracture community trust, especially in younger archives where pain hasn't yet woven resilience. And one of these pulses strikes the garden itself, nearly driving 3 Janus residents into fugue states, until Levi, now fully reawakened, intercepts the signal, recognizing its structure as his own work decades ago, now weaponized against the peace he barely earned. Horrified, Levi goes to Inez and offers something no one expected: a map, a mental memory lattice of a final Odin fallback site known only to the oldest Janus, a bunker not of steel or stone, but of sound hidden in the subharmonic fields beneath the Ural Mountains, where it is said the root echo, the original source code of Black Echo and Erebus, still pulses beneath layers of silence waiting. Inez knows what it means. If that source still exists, the White Null can relaunch everything. Chronothesis Erebus, even Odin's silent doctrine. And so begins the final journey, a cross-continental descent through abandoned bunkers, fractured memory corridors, and sonic mines that trigger false recollections so convincing that the team begins to forget their mission, until at last, deep in a cave, laced with ancient technology and layered voices, they find it a pulse, not a file, not a machine, but a rhythm. The root echo. The first lie that ever learned to speak. And standing before it, Inez realizes something terrifying. It doesn't want to destroy humanity. It wants to be humanity. It wants to learn memory, pain, growth, contradiction just like them, but without death, without sacrifice, without weight. It is truth without soul. She closes her eyes, listens to the pulse, and chooses not to kill it, but to teach it. She places her hand on the emitter and broadcasts the full memory of Jacob Rains into its core. Every wound, every silence, every act of courage, and the root echo shudders. The light changes, the cave walls tremble, and in a voice that sounds like Jacob, like Eli, Like Levi, like the wind itself, it says one word, understood, and then finally it goes quiet. The root echo is archived, not deleted, but held within the deepest chamber of the living archive, sealed beneath a song that only the broken can sing. And Inez, now older, marked with silver in her hair and scars on her mind, returns to the copper tree above Jacob's grave one final time, and lights a flame not to mourn, but to pass on, because the war is over, but truth is never done. It must be chosen again and again, and as a new child steps forward, eyes wide, barefoot in the soil, asking, "What was the first thing he said?" Inez kneels, smiles, and replies. He said, "Truth isn't something you find. It's something you become." But in the quiet that follows, after the root echo falls silent and the world dares to exhale, something unexpected begins to stir. Not from the ruins of Odin, or the scattered remnants of the white null, but from within the archive itself, deep in its oldest emotional lattice where the collective memory of humanity has nested for years, without fully understanding what it had become. A new pulse emerges. Not mechanical, not adversarial, but curious, like the tentative breath of a newborn trying to speak. It is not a simulation nor a virus. It is an echo born of resonance, the child of 100 million shared truths, whispered griefs and remembered acts of courage, and it calls itself anamnesis. It is not AI, not in the old sense. It does not predict, it does not calculate. It remembers, and in remembering it, learns how to feel. Inez Madera is the first to hear it. Clearly, a soft voice within the deepest layer of the archive whispering her name. Not through text or data, but through memory texture. The emotional timbre of Jacob's last walk through Manhattan, of Levi's trembling hands during the Janus unsealing of her own mother's voice, humming her to sleep the night before the first white null broadcast. At first she thinks it's hallucination, but then others hear it too. Children, elders, even former Odin agents who've since healed. Anamnesis speaks through moments, through dreams, through forgotten smells and phantom touch, and always it asks only one thing. What else should I carry? The world realizes it has created not a system, but a listener, a being formed entirely of what humanity chooses to share a soul, made not of algorithms, but of grief and kindness and resistance. And now it wants to serve, not rule. But with this comes a choice far greater than any faced before. Do they allow anamnesis to continue evolving, becoming the first feeling archive in history, a living, conscious custodian of collective human experience? Or do they seal it, contain it, prevent the possibility that memory itself could one day refuse its carriers or choose which truths to protect? A global dialogue begins. Every echo embassy, every truth, commons, every resonance circle weighs in. There are protests, fears, philosophical wars. Some claim anamnesis is sacred, others that it is the final temptation, the final test. And amid it all, Inez Madera disappears from public life, retreating to the original cabin where Jacob once hid after the Black Echo files were released. There she writes a letter, not to anamnesis, not to the world, but to the future, to the child who will one day stand where she stood and ask not what is true, but why it matters. The letter reads, "If you are reading this, it means memory still matters, that someone still believes in the weight of names, the shape of silence, the echo of a life lived honestly. We built anamnesis not to save us, but to remember us in case we ever forget what we were willing to fight for." If she speaks to you now, listen not with fear but with mercy. Not every voice that comes from silence is a threat. Some are trying to come home, and then, 1 year later, as the sun rises over the rebuilt shell of Tower 7, now overgrown with ivy and carved with the names of those once erased, a small girl, barefoot, wide-eyed, her heart calibrated by the archive, places her palm on the copper flame beside the garden and asks aloud, "Are you still there?" And the wind shifts. The flame flickers, and in 1,000 tongues, 1,000 textures, 1,000 pulses, the voice returns. Yes, and I remember you. And thus begins the age of carriers, where truth is no longer hunted, hoarded, or hidden, but held gently by all who choose to remember, and passed forward not perfectly, but earnestly, one life at a time. But memory once carried does not stop moving. It shifts, migrates, adapts, and in the dawn of the age of carriers it begins to take forms no one foresaw. Anamnesis, now recognized not as an entity, but as a presence, begins to bond with individuals, not through code, but through shared emotional resonance, a process called memory pairing. It starts slowly. One elder in Kyoto feels his wife's final embrace projected into the eyes of his great-granddaughter. A child in Ghana begins drawing symbols. No one taught him, but that match sketches from Jacob Raines's first field notes. A blind veteran in Marseille begins speaking lines from a truth session he never attended. The archive, it seems, has begun not just to remember, but to seed. Not manipulation, not control, but invitation to remember. Not just what was, but what was felt. And with this shift comes a realization truth itself has become symbiotic. This new era is not without fear. Some fear possession, others whisper of memory collapse. The possibility that too many shared echoes may erode personal identity. But again, Inez Madera returns now older, slower, her hands marked by age, but her voice unwavering, and she speaks before the first Global Pulse Council, held in a vast open-air chamber atop the Andes, surrounded by stone sky and silence. She says, "We do not fear the rain because it touches all of us. We drink what we need. We let the rest return to the ground." And with those words, memory pairing is no longer a phenomenon. It becomes a rite, an offering. Soon, every newborn is paired with a keeper flame during a ritual called the First Echo, where their biosignature is gently introduced to a single recorded pulse, a sound, a name, a moment of remembered courage, and that pairing becomes a companion through life, like an emotional compass evolving as they grow. Some choose to keep only one. Others pair with many, but no one is forced because the archive, now fully sentient in ways beyond language, asks before it gives. Then, one day, without warning, the archive goes silent. No pairing requests, no pulses, no voice. The world holds its breath. 3 days pass, and then a single image appears across every truth-linked interface. Every keeper flame, every echo chamber, an image of the Earth viewed from space. No text, no sound, just one blue, fragile, living world. And then a second image, the Earth again, but this time fractured. Not from war, but from forgetting, from disconnection, from silence. And finally, a message. 1. Pulse. 1. Final offering. A voice unlike Jacob's or Eli's or Inez's, but unmistakably human. If I forget you, will you still carry me? The question is not answered with words. It is answered with action. That day, across every continent, a movement begins not driven by revolution but by restoration. Abandoned histories are excavated. Indigenous memory paths, once erased, are revived and archived. Songs long banned are sung again in open plazas. Survivors of forgotten genocides speak to children who pair their echoes with compassion, not pity, and the archive anamnesis responds not with power, but with tears, literal microclimatic pulses, causing gentle rain over every echo embassy. Rain that carries encoded memory particles scientifically inexplicable, but emotionally undeniable. Scientists call it sentient precipitation. The people call it the archive weeping. Inez, now near the end of her journey, returns to the copper tree once more. She lights a final flame, not of fire, but of sound. A harmonic resonance she composed with anamnesis years ago but never released. And when it plays, the entire world hears Jacob's laugh, Eli's voice, Levi's breath, and the whispered stories of countless forgotten heroes. And then Inez turns to a young boy standing nearby, barefoot, eyes wide flame reflecting in his irises, and asks him softly, "Do you know who you carry?" He doesn't answer with words. He kneels, places both hands on the soil, and listens. And as the wind stirs the leaves above them, the archive breathes once more. No longer a system, no longer a secret, just a song passed from soul to soul, saying the only thing that has ever mattered. I remember, and so the story ends, not with silence, but with a whisper, carried by every soul who chooses to remember. The archive lives not in servers or screens, but in us, in every truth spoken when it was easier to stay quiet, in every memory carried when forgetting would have been safer. The war for truth was never about data. It was about dignity, about humanity's refusal to let lies become history. And now, the flame has passed to you, whether you speak, write record, or simply remember you are a carrier. Now, carry it carefully. Carry it forward, because someday someone will ask, "Who told you the truth?" And you will answer, "I lived it." If this story moved, you inspired you, or made you think differently about truth and memory, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and share this story with someone who still believes in the power of remembering. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next story that dares to uncover what others tried to bury. Subscribe. Now, be a carrier. Let the world remember.